Welcome to the second session of the Gifts Compass training in Jung's psychological types. This is session 2, the Compass of Consciousness. The aim of this session is to acquaint you with Jung's 8 dispositions of ego consciousness, considered as a compass. Jung always had his type model in mind as a conceptual compass. He wrote, "I would not for anything dispense with this compass on my psychological voyages of discovery." So in this session, we will consider the types as a compass of ego consciousness. Later, we will consider the type compass as it is also active in the unconscious. In this session, we'll be reviewing key terms that are relevant for understanding Jung's model of psychological type. We'll be looking at ego and function, the great divide, libido, extroversion and introversion, orientation and attitude, apprehend versus perceive, phenomenon and noumenon, rational versus receptive, the 8 composite attitudes, the term type, and the 5 comparative categories. By ego, Jung wrote, "I understand a complex of ideas which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a high degree of continuity and identity. By psychological function, I mean a particular form of psychic activity that remains the same in principle under varying conditions. In Jung's model, there are only 4 ego functions: sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking. He would have considered more, but he said he could not find any. These 4 functions, this conscious activity that remains the same principle under varying conditions, will form the basis of the 8 types. In session 1, we noted that psychological types are not personality types. The personality encompasses the whole psyche. Persons have egos, but they are not their egos. The unconscious also has typological orientations. The shadow will typically adopt orientations that are diametrically opposed to the ego dispositions. The soul, as a typological extension of the shadow, will adopt a typological disposition similar to the shadow. For the next 3 sessions, we will focus primarily on understanding the ego's orientations. In the final 3 sessions of the course, we will consider their complementary oppositions in the unconscious, along with the processes of individuation. The first division in consciousness that we will consider is the division between an orientation to the outer object versus an orientation to the inner object. We are amphibious beings, oriented to life in 2 directions: the outer object, the world around us, but also to the inner object, the archetypal unconscious. Which orientation we are most disposed to greatly influences the life we live. In the introduction to volume 6 of the collected works, Jung included this quote from Heinrich Heine, which aptly characterizes orientations on both sides of the Great Divide. Plato and Aristotle, these are not merely 2 systems, they are types of 2 distinct human natures, which from time immemorial, under every sort of disguise, stand more or less inimically opposed. The whole medieval world in particular was riven by this conflict, which persists down to the present day and which forms the most essential content of the history of the Christian Church. Although under other names, it is always of Plato and Aristotle that we speak. Jung's comments about these 2 directions of libido energy characterizes the fundamental division. He said, "By libido, I mean psychic energy, And extroversion is an outward turning of libido, while introversion means an inward turning of libido. There are two fundamental terms in Jung's model without which it will be nearly impossible to understand all 8 types. These two terms apply both to libido energy, introversion or extroversion, and the 4 functions. The terms are attitude and orientation. Jung says, for us, attitude is a readiness of the psyche to act or react in a certain way. Attitude signifies expectation, and expectation always operates selectively with a sense of direction. For orientation, he wrote, I use this term to denote the general principle governing an attitude. Every attitude is oriented by a certain viewpoint, no matter whether this viewpoint is conscious or not. A thinking attitude is oriented by the principle of logic as its supreme law. A sensation attitude is oriented by the sensuous perception of given facts. Jung talks about attitude as a figurative bridge abutment, poised and ready to thrust a bridge to the opposite shore. It is fixed. That which it is oriented to, that which it is ready to act upon or thrust its bridge over to, is the orientation or governing principle. We have 2 functions that are oriented along the direction of the Great Divide. Intuition to the north, and sensation to the south. Intuition is ready to receive the contents of the inner object. That is its attitude. The inner object is its orientation. Its function is to become aware of the contents of the inner object. Sensation is ready to receive the contents of the outer object. That is its attitude. The outer object is its orientation. Its function is to become aware of the contents of the outer object. Jung referred to these 2 functions as irrational, which tells us what they do not do. That is, they are not rationally directing consciousness. To attempt to better consider their functional attitude and orientation, we will refer to them as receptive functions, a more descriptive term for their active roles. At this juncture, let's pause to consider what these 2 functions are actually receiving. Jung was a philosophy student early in life, drawn to German idealism. Kant and the idealists distinguished between what we perceive to be present and what is actually present. We do not perceive the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. We perceive representations of the thing in itself. The intellectual premises of 18th century European Enlightenment may have instilled a modern implicit bias towards a reliance on empirical facts and rational logic. Yet the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers, Immanuel Kant, demonstrated that neither sensory perception nor rational thought ought to be relied upon to interpret what is real. They can only be relied upon to interpret reality through predetermined mental frameworks. Jung understood this dilemma well, for at the start of volume 6, he notes, the demand that he should see only objectively is quite out of the question, for it is impossible. So when we talk about intuition and sensation being receptive functions, we are talking about their perceptions of representations of what is there. That is, representations of either the inner or outer object. The objects themselves would be considered the noumena, or what Kant would call the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. What we perceive would be the phenomena, how they appear to us through a priori mental frameworks. What intuition is perceiving of the inner object are representations of noumena, which are different in character from the representations of the outer object. For intuition, the perceptions could be thought of as a painting by Chagall, where time, space, form are not significant elements of the noumena. For sensation, we might think of Vermeer, where every aspect of the representations of the noumena can be considered in tangible detail. Because the qualities of the inner and outer objects are so different, we will use different terms for the two receptive functions. Doing so will also help us to understand later how the types tend to collaborate or oppose one another. For intuition, we will use the term apprehend. Intuition apprehends the representations of the inner object, the archetypal unconscious. For sensation, we will use the term perceive. Sensation perceives the representations of the outer object, the manifold world at large. Note that in both cases, we are dealing with consciousness of the representations of the contents of either the inner or outer object. The two objects therefore have an equal footing in Jung's model. Neither is more real than the other. We perceive colors, not wavelengths. We apprehend images, not the archetypes themselves. These two receptive functions are attitudes. Each is ready to act, to either apprehend or perceive the contents of the inner or outer objects. In addition to the two receptive functions, two other functions are available: thinking and feeling. The thinking attitude actively applies the governing principle of logic. Someone oriented toward logic will tend to apply the thinking attitude to make sense of experience, to order or direct it. The feeling attitude actively applies the governing principle of value. Someone oriented to value will tend to apply the feeling attitude to make sense of life experience, to order or direct it. As Jung speaks of the feeling attitude, it's not emotion. Emotions are actually not part of the compass of consciousness. They are among several conscious experiences excluded from this model. For Jung, the feeling function is a rational mode of judgment, just as logic is. Jung's model regards each orientation to be equally valid. Logical judgment is just as valid as judgment based on valuations. The representations of the inner object are just as valid as the representations of the outer object. A functional attitude is a readiness to apply a governing principle, inner or outer object, logic, or value. A directional attitude is a readiness to direct psychic energy to either the inner or outer object. We might think of it as a kind of wind that blows by, whisking a functional attitude in one direction or another. Or we might think of libido energy as a kind of magnetic pull orienting the functional attitudes to either the inner or outer object. The functional readiness to act on one of the four governing principles is invigorated with a directional attitude, energizing the action toward either the inner or outer object. The directional attitudes are capable of merging with the functional attitudes. For example, the thinking attitude is a readiness to apply logic. An introverted attitude is a readiness to apply psychic energy toward the inner object. Introverted thinking is a composite attitude that merges the introverted directional attitude with the functional thinking attitude. The composite attitudes are types. The term type, as Jung uses it, may also refer to any attitude habitually relied upon. One could have a typical thinking attitude, a typical introverted attitude, or a typical introverted thinking attitude. Although it might sometimes be useful to characterize someone that way, putting people in categories can be a slippery slope. We can forget that behind the persona of an ego disposition, there is a unique person individuating. Our work with the Gifts Compass inventory suggests that classification systems can be far too reductive. They do not begin to capture the full dimensions of dynamically integrated type dispositions. Instead of classifying people by type dispositions, we prefer to read the melody of all 8 types engaged in both consciousness and in the unconscious. So in this training, we will use the term type only when referring to the 8 composite attitudes: introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted sensation, and extroverted sensation. So let's take a quick look at the qualities of the merged attitudes as they appear on our compass of consciousness. We will begin this tour with the 2 most unusual types, the 2 that could be considered crossover types. Each begins with an orientation on one side of the Great Divide, and with the application of libido energy, is swept to the other side. Intuition shares a common governing principle with introversion, the inner object. Sensation shares a common governing principle with extroversion, the outer object. When sensation, which begins with an orientation to the outer object, ends with an orientation to the inner object, it has crossed over the Great Divide. Similarly, intuition begins with an orientation to the inner object and ends with an orientation to the outer object. It too crosses over. In the qualities of the resulting merged types, the directional attitude prevails. The functional attitude is subordinate to the directional attitude. Introverted sensation has more in common with introverted intuition than it does with extroverted sensation, just as extroverted intuition has more in common with extroverted sensation than it does with introverted intuition. Here's some of what Jung has to say about each. We could say that introverted sensation transmits an image which does not so much reproduce the object as spread over it the patina of age-old subjective experience and the shimmer of events still unborn. The primary function of intuition is simply to transmit images or perceptions of relations between things, which could not be transmitted by other functions. But since extroverted intuition is directed predominantly to objects, it actually comes very close to sensation. We will see in the course that extroversion carries sensation-like attributes and introversion carries intuition-like attributes. Introverted intuition and extroverted sensation could be considered the quintessential types. These are the only 2 types where the directional and functional orientations align. They could be considered quintessential in that the directional orientation amplifies the functional orientation and does not change it with its directional energy. The directional and functional orientations for the extroverted rational types, extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, neither conflict nor amplify one another. The functional orientations are distinctly different from the directional orientation, but they are able to readily merge into a composite orientation. The extroverted attitude will render the feeling attitude, the opposite of the thinking attitude, highly compatible with extroverted thinking. They both become oriented to the outer object and will take on similar attributes due to that orientation. The introverted attitude will also render the feeling attitude highly compatible with the thinking attitude. They both become oriented to the inner object and will take on similar attributes due to that orientation. As we proceed in the course, we'll be using the following 5 comparative categories to assess the character of each type, as well as possible collaborations and oppositions. Composite orientation will be the merger of functional and directional orientations. Composite attitude will be the merger of functional and directional attitudes. The new functional role is the revised role of the function as altered by its directional attitude. Composite substance will be the primary material engaged in the new functional role. And composite scope focuses on either the particular or the whole, depending on its directional attitude. The comparative categories were born out of the dilemma of the crossover types. We did not understand how introverted sensation could be both oriented to the outer and inner objects simultaneously. So we built the 5 comparative categories primarily to understand that one type. Then they proved useful for more fully understanding each of the other types and how the directional attitude tends to overcome the functional attitude, rendering the types more compatible when oriented to a common directional attitude. We will consider these categories in sessions 3 and 4 when we review each of the types individually, in session 5 when we consider how they collaborate, and in session 6 when we consider how they can oppose one another. To briefly visit the Gibbs compass diagram, you can begin to see how some of the terms and elements of the diagram took shape. The inward needles are the 8 types, considered as gift sets, and named for their new functional role. Conceptual is introverted thinking. Visionary is introverted intuition. Aesthetic, introverted sensation. Idealistic, introverted feeling. Constructive, extroverted thinking. Catalytic, extroverted intuition. Realistic, extroverted sensation. And social, extroverted feeling. The 4 cardinal points are the composite orientations for both directional and functional attitudes. So in this session, we have reviewed ego and function, the great divide, libido, extroversion and introversion, orientation and attitude, apprehend versus perceive, phenomenon and noumenon, rational versus receptive, the 8 composite attitudes, the term type, and the 5 comparative categories.